April 1980, a construction crew in Jerusalem broke through a sealed tomb. Inside, 10 limestone bone boxes. One said, carved in Aramaic, Judah, son of Yeshua. I found that detail buried in a footnote while rereading J.J. Benítez 3 months ago, and since then I cannot leave it alone. The Israel Antiquities Authority was called in 1980. A man named Amos Cloner filed an excavation report. The 10 ossuaries were documented. The tomb was sealed again. And for 27 years, nothing. No press conference. No announcement to the world. No one told the public that sitting in an Israeli government storage facility was a bone box with the words, Son of Jesus, carved into limestone. 27 years. I want to tell you about that name, and about why the people who are supposed to have answers about Jesus, the historians, the theologians, the institutional spokespeople, find this particular question so difficult to answer cleanly. My name is Nathan. I spent 12 years teaching history at a Catholic school in Indiana. I taught students about early Christianity, about the Church Fathers, about how the faith spread across the Roman Empire. I taught it with conviction. I believed I was giving them an accurate picture of something real. There is an anger that comes after you realize what you were actually giving them. Not a sharp anger, not the kind that passes when you find the answer. A slower one, the kind that settles in when you understand that certain questions were available the entire time. The sources were there, the evidence was there, the historical record was there, and you weren't looking in the right direction because the curriculum pointed you somewhere else. I am not angry at individual people. I want to be honest about that. I'm angry at a structure, a system that made certain questions seem unnecessary, made certain sources seem marginal, made the story of Jesus's actual biological family, the people who shared his blood and carried his lineage, seem like a fringe concern rather than a central historical question. And now I know things I cannot unknow. So let me tell you what I found. Before I go further, if you're the kind of person who can't release a question until you've followed it all the way through, this channel was built for you. Subscribe. The algorithm needs that signal to know you want this conversation. I have a lot more of these journeys ahead, and I don't want you to miss them. The thing that broke through first was not the Talpiot tomb. I didn't find that until much later. What broke through first was a word I had never encountered in 12 years of teaching Christian history. Desposyni. I stumbled across it in a footnote. Not even the main text a footnote. While reading something for an entirely different project, the footnote said, and I remember rereading it 3 times to make sure I had understood it correctly. Blood relatives of Jesus, actively persecuted by the Roman Empire in the 1st century CE. The Roman Empire was persecuting the relatives of Jesus. In the 1st century, during and immediately after his lifetime, not as a matter of theological disagreement, as a matter of political threat. I put the book down. I poured coffee. I picked it back up, because that sentence meant something that contradicted a picture I had been carrying for over a decade. Jesus' family was not a historical footnote. They were not people who disappeared quietly after the crucifixion, fading into agricultural obscurity in Galilee. They were real enough, present enough, politically significant enough that the most powerful empire in the ancient world was tracking them down. You do not hunt down the relatives of irrelevant men. And once I understood that, once I understood that the Desposyni were real enough to frighten Rome, I had a question I couldn't satisfy with anything in the curriculum I had been teaching from. If Rome was afraid of the family, what happened to all of them? What happened to a daughter, if there was one? The word Desposyni comes from the Greek root despotes, Lord, Master, applied to biological relatives of Jesus, not as a metaphor, not as a title of honor, as a literal designation for people who shared his blood. This is not a term invented by conspiracy theorists or alternative historians. It is documented by Julius Africanus, a scholar who lived from roughly 160 to 240 CE, close enough to the events to speak with people who carried direct knowledge. Julius Africanus wrote explicitly that relatives of Jesus were still alive in his time, moving between Nazareth and Kochaba in Judea. And he records something I want you to hear carefully. They were hiding their genealogies. Deliberately. Carrying their family records in secret, moving between towns to avoid being identified. They were in hiding. More than 100 years after the crucifixion, people who could trace their bloodline directly to Jesus were actively concealing that fact for their own survival. Then there is Hegesippus, a 2nd century chronicler whose work did not survive in full, but whose fragments were preserved by Eusebius of Caesarea in his Historia Ecclesiastica, essentially the first official history of the Christian Church. Hegesippus records something that I think changes everything about how we understand early Christian history. Emperor Domitian, who ruled the Roman Empire from 81 to 96 CE, personally summoned the grandsons of Jude, the brother of Jesus, for interrogation. Let me be precise about what that means. Domitian was one of the most powerful men in the known world. He had an empire to administer. He was not a theologian. He was not a religious historian. He had no reason to care about the family of an executed Jewish preacher from Galilee, unless that family represented a political threat serious enough to require his personal attention. And that is exactly what they represented. Domitian's fear was structural. It was the same fear Herod had felt about the infant Jesus. A descendant of the house of David with a legitimate genealogical claim could become a rallying point, could attract followers, could undermine Roman authority in a province that had just survived a devastating war. The Jewish-Roman War had ended barely a decade earlier, in 70 CE, with the destruction of Jerusalem. The wound was fresh, the political instability was real, and a messianic claimant from the right bloodline was not a theological inconvenience. It was a military problem. So Domitian summoned the grandnephews of Jesus, the grandsons of Jude. They showed him their hands, calloused hands, farmers' hands. They told him they were humble men who worked the land. They owned a small farm worth 9,000 denarii. They were not claimants to anything, not dangerous to anyone. Hegesippus records that Domitian examined them, concluded they posed no threat, and released them. But here is what won't stop echoing for me. The Roman emperor personally interrogated Jesus' grandnephews. That meeting is in the historical record. Hegesippus recorded it. Eusebius preserved it. It happened. You do not personally interrogate the grandnephews of an irrelevant man. And if Rome was tracking down the grandsons of Jesus' brother in 90-something CE, monitoring them, summoning them, evaluating whether they needed to be eliminated, what would Rome, and what would the institutional church that eventually made peace with Rome and inherited its political logic have done about a daughter? A daughter of Jesus, if she existed, would not appear in the same census records as a son. She would not carry the name. She would marry into another family, take that family's surname, disappear genealogically into a lineage that wasn't being watched. She would be, from a surveillance perspective, almost impossible to track, and from a suppression perspective, almost impossible to document even if you wanted to. This is where the story gets complicated, and I want to be honest about where I almost lost the thread entirely. Because there is a version of this story that went everywhere before I ever started digging. You probably know it, Holy Blood, Holy Grail. The 1982 book by Michael Bagent, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln. They argued that Jesus married Mary Magdalene, had at least one child, probably a daughter named Sarah, and that this bloodline eventually merged into the Merovingian dynasty of medieval France. The book sold millions of copies. Dan Brown built the Da Vinci Code on its foundation and turned the bloodline thesis into a global cultural event. and then it collapsed. The entire theoretical structure rested on a set of documents called the Dossier Secret, deposited at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. These documents supposedly proved the existence of a secret society, the Priory of Sion, that had guarded the bloodline for centuries, passing the secret through a lineage of grandmasters that included Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, Victor Hugo. In 1993, before a French court, a man named Pierre Plantard confessed that he had fabricated everything. The Priory of Sion was a 20th century invention. He had created it himself in 1956. He had planted the forged documents at the National Library. He had watched the world construct an elaborate theory on his fabrication, and for a period of time he had been, in his own estimation, the secret grand master of an organization that existed only in his imagination and in documents he had written himself. When that came out, the question got contaminated, not the historical question. That question predates Begint and Lincoln by 1900 years, but the cultural frame around it became toxic. If you mentioned Jesus having children, you were associated with secret societies, with Dan Brown fiction, with people who believed in hidden symbolism in Renaissance paintings. Serious scholars, and there are serious scholars working on this territory, found their work dismissed before it could be evaluated, because the contamination was so complete. This is where I almost stopped. I want to be precise about this moment because I think a lot of people get stuck here. I had stacks of material on the table. I had James Tabor's academic work. I had Robert Eisenman's work. I had the Talpiot documentation. I had Julius Africanus and Hegesippus and the Desposyni records. I had a picture that was building towards something real, and I was sitting with all of it at something like 11 at night, tired, and the thought came, does continuing this make me the kind of person who argues online about secret bloodlines and ancient codes? I put everything away. I went to bed. But when I came back to it the next morning, something had shifted. Because the question that stayed, the one I couldn't dismiss overnight, was not, did Begint and Lincoln get it right? I already knew they didn't. The question was simpler and harder than that. Why does the institution responsible for preserving Jesus' legacy consistently behave as though his biological family is a problem to be managed? That question has nothing to do with Pierre Plantard. Pierre Plantard was a fraud, but the historical record of the Desposyni is not Plantard's invention. Julius Africanus is not Plantard's invention. Hegesippus is not Plantard's invention. The fact that Domitian personally interrogated Jesus' grandnephews in the 1st century is not contaminated by a 20th century Frenchman's forgeries. Begint and Lincoln found a real gap in the historical record and filled it with the wrong answer. Debunking their answer does not close the gap. The gap is still there. It was there before they wrote their book. It will be there long after their book is forgotten. That's what I had to accept before I could continue. James Tabor's work is where I found firmer ground. Tabor is not a fringe figure. He spent decades as a professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. His book, The Jesus Dynasty, published by Simon & Schuster in 2006, was reviewed in serious academic journals: the Biblical Archaeology Review, the Journal of Theological Studies, the New York Times. It made a different argument from Begint and Lincoln, an argument that is historically grounded and significantly harder to dismiss because it doesn't depend on secret societies or forged documents. It depends on the internal logic of 1st century Jewish social structures. Tabor's argument is this: Jesus understood himself as a Davidic messianic king. The movement he founded was dynastic. It operated on succession principles that were entirely normal for 1st century Jewish movements. Leadership passed within the family, by blood, by recognized genealogical right. James, Jesus' brother, was not the first bishop in some administrative sense we would recognize from later church governance. James was the heir, the legitimate dynastic successor. and the movement under James operated on that premise openly, in a way that was understood by everyone in the Jerusalem community. And Paul's version of Christianity, the version that eventually became dominant, required the destruction of that dynastic structure. Not because Paul was malicious toward the family, but because a faith built on the cosmic resurrection of a divine Savior does not need a human bloodline to authorize its claims. In fact, a human bloodline actively undermines them. If Jesus' nephew can claim authority over the community by virtue of shared DNA, then Paul's theology of universal grace faces a structural problem it cannot resolve. The erasure of the family is not incidental to Pauline Christianity. It is built into its architecture. It is a structural necessity. Robert Eisenman, Professor Emeritus of Middle East Religions and Archaeology at California State University, Long Beach, one of the foremost specialists in the Dead Sea Scrolls, spent decades documenting what he calls the family church of Jerusalem. James, the brother of Jesus, his 1996 study published by Viking, makes the case that James's execution in 62 CE was recognized at the time as a political act, not just a religious killing. Eisenman documents that the death caused public outrage disproportionate to James's individual popularity. The outrage was because killing a recognized heir is something that politically literate people understand as political. And people in 62 CE were politically literate enough to understand it as such. The family was the movement, and the movement was being systematically dismantled. Now extend that logic. If a son would be institutionally inconvenient, visible, named, carrying the family identity in ways that could be tracked and challenged, what would a daughter be? A daughter who existed, who was known in her community, who grew up, married, had children, whose children carried the bloodline of the house of David under a different surname, in a different family, in a different geography. A daughter would not be tracked the way a son would be tracked. She would move through history the way women moved through patriarchal history, mostly undocumented. Her name would not appear in the legal records, the census data, the genealogies that were written down and preserved. That absence of documentation is not evidence that she didn't exist. In first-century Judea, daughters routinely left almost no documentary trace, regardless of who their father was. And for an institution that needed Jesus to have left no one, no wife with a claim, no children with a claim, no relatives with a claim, nothing that could authorize an alternative center of gravity, a daughter's silence in the record would not be a problem to explain. It would be an outcome to rely on. If you want to go deeper into the philosophical and historical questions underneath what we have been discussing, who controls what we know, how knowledge gets shaped and suppressed, and why, I genuinely recommend the Spinoza Forever Library. 5 volumes. The kind of reading that changes how you approach every other source. Link in the description. The piece that made everything else rearrange was a meeting that happened in 318 CE. Malachi Martin documented it in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Church, published in 1981. Martin's background matters here. He was a Jesuit theologian, a former peritus, a theological expert at Vatican II, a professor at the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome. He was not someone hostile to the church. He was someone who knew the church's institutional history very well and was willing to write about what he found there with unusual candor. In 318 CE, a delegation of Desposyni, documented blood relatives of Jesus whose kinship was not disputed, traveled to Rome. They requested a meeting with Pope Sylvester I. The meeting happened. They made a specific demand: the restoration of their leadership over the original churches of Jerusalem, Antioch, Ephesus, and Alexandria. Churches, they claimed, by right of blood, the same dynastic right that had governed the original Jerusalem community under James. More than 300 years after the crucifixion, the biological relatives of Jesus were still a coherent enough group to organize a formal delegation, travel to the seat of imperial power, and make a documented claim. Pope Sylvester refused. He declared that the authority of those churches now belonged to Constantine's imperial structure. The Desposyni were dismissed. They left Rome. And after that meeting, they disappear from the historical record entirely. No further documentation, no further delegations, no further claims on record, as though the dismissal was also somehow an erasure. I want to be slow about what this tells us. In 318 CE, after Constantine, after Nicaea, after the moment when the Church and the Roman Empire formally align, the official leadership of Christianity sat across a table from the acknowledged biological relatives of Jesus Christ and told them their bloodline was now irrelevant to the governance of the faith they had inherited, not disputed, not challenged as fraudulent. Their kinship was not in question. They were dismissed because their lineage, while real, was no longer what the institution recognized as the basis of authority. That is a documented event. It has a date, it has a location, it has a recorded outcome. And what it tells me is that the suppression of Jesus' family is not a conspiracy theory. It is an institutional position, one that was formalized in 318 CE, but that clearly preceded that meeting by a very long time, because the meeting only happens because there is still a living, organized family to suppress 3 centuries later. Work backwards from 318. If the dismissal of the Desposyni becomes formal policy in 318, the informal version of that policy had to begin much earlier. It begins in 62 CE with the killing of James, the recognized dynastic heir, whose death provoked political outrage. It is visible in Julius Africanus' 2nd century observation that relatives of Jesus are hiding their genealogies, carrying their records in secret, moving between towns to avoid identification. It is visible in Domitian's interrogation of Jesus' grandnephews in the final decades of the 1st century. This is not a single decision. It is a current, running through centuries. And a daughter, if she existed, if she was known to her community, would have been caught in that current before she was old enough to leave any record at all. The Talpiot ossuary changes meaning in this context. The tomb was discovered in 1980. Kloner filed his report in 96. In 2007, Simcha Jakobowiczi's documentary aired on the Discovery Channel, and the public heard about it for the first time. The institutional response was swift. Archaeologists, church representatives, and mainstream media dismissed the tomb within days. Common names. Statistical coincidence. Case closed. But one detail has never been given a satisfying explanation. The ossuary inscribed Judah son of Yeshua, a son of someone named Jesus, sits in an Israel Antiquities Authority storage facility right now. That physical object exists. The official answer is common names. Maybe it is. Yeshua was not uncommon in 1st century Judea, nor was Judah. And mainstream archaeologists, including Jody Magnus at the University of North Carolina, one of the most credible voices in 1st century Jewish burial archaeology, are right to insist on statistical rigor before making identifications of this magnitude. Galilean families did not typically have Jerusalem family tombs. The names, taken individually, are not conclusive. But Mariamene Mara, the Greek inscription on another ossuary in that same tomb, is not a common name. It appears nowhere else in the 1st century Judean archaeological record. And mitochondrial DNA analysis of the remains established that Mariamene and Yeshua were not maternally related, not mother and son, which means, in the context of a family tomb, possibly spouses. A man named Yeshua, son of Joseph, buried alongside a woman named Mariamene Mara, who was not his mother, with another ossuary in the same tomb inscribed Judah, son of Yeshua. That combination, those 3 objects in one sealed tomb, in one place from the same approximate time period, has not received a clean, unified explanation. Common names covers the individual inscriptions. It does not explain the combination. It does not explain Maria Mene Mara. It does not explain the DNA result that rules out the most obvious innocent interpretation. I am not saying it is Jesus's family tomb. The statistical objections are real, and I am not going to pretend they are not. I am saying the official explanation has a gap, and the gap, specific, stubborn, and persistent across nearly 50 years of scholarship, is exactly where the question of Jesus's children has always lived. If that tomb does belong to the family, then Judah, son of Yeshua, is a son, not a daughter. But it is evidence that children existed. And a daughter, in that culture and that political context, would leave less documentary trace than a son by default. The silence around a daughter is the expected outcome whether she existed or not. That is not a convenient escape hatch. That is what the historical and social conditions of first-century Judea actually predict. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is the predicted result of patriarchal record-keeping in a context where suppressing a bloodline was already an active institutional concern. Those two facts together, the predictable documentary silence around first-century women and the active suppression of Jesus's family, mean that the absence of proof of a daughter cannot be treated as disproof. The silence is doing exactly what the circumstances would produce whether she was there or not. Here is what I actually lost in this. I came into this research with a specific self-understanding. I was the person asking the questions now, not the person who had failed to ask them before. I was outside the problem. I was the one digging. But the more I dug, the more I started remembering specific moments from those 12 years in the classroom. The students who asked about Mary Magdalene and whether she and Jesus had a relationship. I gave them the standard answer. The Church formally acknowledged in 1969 that Pope Gregory I's sermon in 591 CE had been wrong, that Mary had never actually been identified as a sinner in Scripture, that the prostitute label was a theological mistake. Problem solved. The Church corrected it. But I never told them that the mistake had stood for 1,400 years. I never told them that 14 centuries of believers had been given a false picture by an institution that claimed to preserve truth. I gave them the correction without the context that makes the correction meaningful, without the question of what else might be waiting somewhere for a future correction that also takes 14 centuries. Why? Not because I was deliberately protecting the institution, because I had been given the correction without the context too. The curriculum offered me the clean version. The Church makes mistakes, acknowledges them, moves on. The system works. And I was comfortable in that because I was part of the system, part of the structure. One more participant in the machinery that delivered settled answers to people who were looking for them. Now I understand that the question of Jesus's daughter, whether she existed, whether she was suppressed, whether the pattern of silence around her is the result of deliberate policy or the accumulated weight of institutional convenience, is not a question I can evaluate from any neutral position. There is no neutral position. I was not outside the problem. I was a participant in the structure that benefits from certain things being settled, certain questions being fringe, certain parts of the historical record being treated as curiosities rather than evidence worth examining. I taught the Desposyni as a footnote, if I mentioned them at all. I taught the brothers of Jesus as probably cousins, using Jerome's argument without examining when Jerome made it or why. I taught perpetual virginity as established doctrine without examining how late that establishment actually came or what it required suppressing to survive. And there is a kind of distance you lose when you understand that. Not a dramatic distance, a quiet one. The comfortable position of the observer who is just following the sources, just doing the research, just looking for the truth without a stake in the outcome. That position doesn't exist here. I cannot go back to it. Every time I read a document about early Christianity now, there is a question underneath the text that wasn't there 12 years ago. What did whoever shaped this need us not to see? I had the curriculum then. I had the synthesis. I had the comfortable summary that made the institution look like it was always working toward understanding. I don't know if the question is better than the summary. It is more honest. Whether that makes it better, I genuinely don't know. But I cannot give it back. I want to pause here and say something directly. This kind of research, the kind that follows footnotes that weren't supposed to matter, that reads sources that don't appear in the comfortable summaries, that builds an argument the institution has reasons not to build. It takes time. It takes access to material that is not easy to compile. And it does not have a department, or a funding body, or an institutional affiliation behind it. It is just me, the sources and the questions that will not go away. If this work has given you something, a different angle on something you thought was settled, a question you hadn't asked before, a piece of history that wasn't in the version you were given, super thanks is a direct way to tell me that matters. It says, keep going. And I want to keep going. And if you want to go deeper into the kind of foundational reading that sits underneath everything I've been discussing, the questions about knowledge and suppression, and who gets to define what counts as credible, the Spinoza Forever Library is exactly that kind of resource. 5 volumes. It changes how you read everything else. Link in the description and pinned in the first comment. Let me come back to April 1980. The bulldozer, the sealed tomb, the bone box with the name on it. I said at the beginning that I wanted to tell you about that name and about why the people who are supposed to answer questions about Jesus find this one so uncomfortable to answer. I think I understand the discomfort now, and it is not what I expected it to be. It is not discomfort at a false claim. If the evidence were obviously false, the institutional response would have been easy. A one-paragraph statement in 1980. The names are common. The statistical case does not hold. This is not Jesus' family. There is nothing to discuss. That statement would have been sufficient if the evidence were simply wrong. Instead, we got 27 years of silence, followed in 2007 by an unusually urgent institutional response to something that was simultaneously being described as obviously irrelevant. Urgent dismissals of obviously irrelevant things are not how institutions behave. The discomfort is at a real question. And the real question is not whether that specific tomb belonged to Jesus' family. The real question, the one the bone box points toward, the one the Desposyni records point toward, the one the 318 CE meeting points toward, is this: what would it mean for the institutional architecture of Western Christianity if Jesus had children? It would mean his movement was dynastic, not just theological. It would mean the early church made a specific, consequential decision to sever authority from bloodline. And that decision was not a theological insight, but a political necessity. It would mean that Sylvester Thurn's dismissal of the Desposyni in 318 was not a correction of a historical misunderstanding, but an assertion. The assertion that power would no longer flow through the family. Power would flow through the institution. And once that assertion was made, every subsequent decision follows from it. Jerome's cousin's argument in 383 CE, his claim that the brothers of Jesus named explicitly in the Gospel of Mark, James and Joseph, and Simon and Judas, must be cousins rather than brothers, is a theological intervention, not a linguistic finding. There is no support for it in the Greek text. The word used is adelphoi, brothers, ordinary brothers. Before Jerome, Tertullian, one of the foundational voices of early Christian theology, writing around 200 CE, explicitly stated that Mary had children after Jesus. Tertullian is not a fringe source. He is cited in almost every serious study of early Christian theology. Jerome's reinterpretation was a political maneuver dressed in linguistic clothing, and I taught it as settled historical fact. The doctrine of Mary's perpetual virginity was not formally established until the Second Council of Constantinople in 553 CE, 553 years after Jesus' death. And before that formalization, the question was open enough that the 2nd century church father Tertullian could state the opposite without controversy. What takes 500 years to formalize was not settled history. It was a position being worked out, defended, refined, institutionalized across centuries. And the institution doing that work had very specific reasons to want the answer to come out the way it did. An institution that claims sole spiritual authority is easier to build when the founder left nothing and no one. No wife with a claim, no children with a claim, no relatives with a claim. Nothing that could authorize an alternative source of legitimacy. The Desposyni showed up in 318 CE to make exactly that alternative claim. They were dismissed. The bone box is still in storage. The inscription hasn't changed. Judah, son of Yeshua. I don't know if Jesus had a daughter. I want to be honest about that, in a way that I was not always honest about the things I taught in that classroom. I don't know. The Talpiot ossuary is contested, and the statistical objections are real. The Desposyni records document a family. They do not document a specific daughter. Tabor's dynastic frame is a scholarly argument that has not achieved anything like consensus. Eisenman's reading of James is powerful and not universally accepted. Malachi Martin's account of the 318 CE meeting exists in a book, not in a Vatican press release. What I know is the shape of the silence, the shape of a doctrine formalized 5 centuries after the fact, the shape of a brotherhood retroactively redefined as cousins to serve a theological need against the evidence of the Greek text and against the testimony of Tertullian. The shape of documented blood relatives traveling to Rome in 318 CE and disappearing from the historical record immediately afterward. The shape of a bone box in government storage since 1980 with an inscription that has no satisfying official explanation. That shape is not random. It has a direction. And the direction points towards something that the institution has been managing, carefully, consistently, and with theological sophistication, for a very long time. The question was never really, did Jesus have a daughter? That is the question you ask when you trust the archive. The question that actually matters, the one the Desposyni records force open, the one Domitian's interrogation forces open, the one the 318 CE dismissal forces open, is this. What would it mean if he did? It would mean the movement was dynastic from the beginning. It would mean the suppression of that dynasty was not a series of unrelated decisions spread across 1700 years, but a coherent institutional logic with identifiable moments. James killed in 62 CE, the family in hiding by the 2nd century CE, the Desposyni dismissed in 318 CE, the brothers retroactively made into cousins in 383 CE, the doctrine of perpetual virginity formalized in 553 CE. Not a conspiracy, a logic, an institutional logic that requires, at each step, that the founder left nothing that could authorize a challenge to the institution that claims to represent him. I spent 12 years teaching students how to read history. The most important thing I taught them, I hope it was the most important thing, was to ask the question underneath the document. Who benefits from what we don't know? I should have turned that question on my own curriculum earlier than I did. I'm turning it now. And I find I cannot stop. Here is the question I want to leave in the comments. Not, do you think Jesus had a daughter? That is not the productive question. The productive question is this: does the pattern we have traced, the Desposyni in hiding in the 2nd century, Domitian's interrogation in the 1st century, the formal dismissal in 318, Jerome's linguistic maneuver in 383, the 5-century delay on perpetual virginity. Does that pattern look random to you? Does it look like the accumulated effect of time and incomplete records and ordinary historical silence? Or does it look managed? Not secret society managed, not Da Vinci Code managed. Just institutionally managed, the way any organization that depends on the authority it claims manages information that creates inconvenient questions about where that authority actually came from. Write your answer in the comments, the specific moment where this either landed for you or where you think I've overreached, because that is the conversation I want this channel to be.